I'd like to welcome everyone to the webinar series of the Cybersecurity and Information Systems Information Analysis Center, CSIAC. Today's presentation is entitled, Phishing for Solutions, Are Cybersecurity Compliance-Based Programs Working? My name is Steve Warzala, and I'm the CSIAC Outreach Manager. A couple of administrative notes before we begin. First, all phones have been muted except for the presenters. Questions may be asked at any time during the presentation by utilizing the chat function. Time permitting, your questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Today's briefing slides will be posted on our website within a few days. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank our sponsor, the Defense Technical Information Center, DTIC. The funding that DTIC provides enables CSIAC to conduct these webinars. My pleasure to introduce our presenter for today's webinar, Dr. Terry Merz. She is a senior research scientist at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Dr. Merz has over 17 years of cybersecurity experience in the areas of research, system engineering, testing, and management. In support of the Navy and the NSA, he focused on the vulnerability testing and design of mitigations for enterprise architectures. He spent several years in the area of cyber incident response, including advanced persistent threats. Research on APTs focused on developing responses to these threats. In addition to APTs, Dr. Merz investigated zero-day vulnerabilities relative to software-enabled devices, and she's incorporated behavioral InfoSec into her applied research activities. Good afternoon, Dr. Merz. The floor is now yours.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. So it's a pleasure being here, and I look forward to offering to you some of the results of our research. So with that said, this is coming out of the Science of Cyber Operations, and it falls into the area of behavioral information security. However, we're going to do a pivot towards the end, towards something that hasn't really been explored yet in cyber, and that's context-centered research relative to the user, and specifically relative to asymmetric cyber events. So I'm going to just briefly give you an overview of what I'd like to chat about. So we're going to talk about give you an introduction on how did I even get here, because by trade, I'm not in any of the behavioral sciences. I'm by trade a computer scientist. So this is something that more or less happened to me, if you will. And then I'll go and introduce the research approach, which involved a development of the problem statement, the hypotheses that supported it, the purpose and the approach to the study. And then what some of our conclusions were from the studies. They were actually, like I said, 2 studies, and the pivot to context-centered research. From there, we'll do a summary and also discuss some of the limitations of the study, so the implications for future practice, and also plenty of new research opportunities. So in going forward, so first I'd like to just level set here so that we're all operating from the same definitions. And I'm sure we all have an understanding of what phishing and spear phishing are, but this is for the sake of ensuring that we're talking about the same things here in research. we approach this as phishing and spear phishing being cyber attacks in a class of social engineering. So we're looking at the sum total social engineering phenomenon that is involved with getting somebody to ultimately click on something or open something using a variety of methodologies, whether that be actual contact in person or electronic transmissions. All these types of social engineering pieces can come together and ultimately lead to a phishing or spear phishing attack. So, but with that said, even though a variety of approaches can be used to actually drive an individual to click on something or to access something nefarious, it always is some form of an electronic communication. So typically, organizations to date have responded by way of training. And then particularly since the implementation of the Computer Security Act of 1987, the U.S. federal government has required cybersecurity training as being a cornerstone of their programs in terms of mitigation of various different threats, to include social engineering threats. Now, one thing that I'd like to just point out here is that despite these efforts, and despite everything that we've been doing for quite some time, 91% of all civil cyber attacks against the federal government came by way of either phishing or spear phishing. So that is an enormous number, and particularly when we look at everything that we are doing, the annual training, the initial training, refreshers, you name it, we are still looking at this particular number. And this was actually the number that drove me to look at the user. So essentially, the way I got started in this is I was studying advanced persistent threats, and I was looking at a specific group of APTs coming from particular actors, and the common entry point was always the user. So I began digging deeper into this and to understand, well, what is exactly happening at that level? Because I can basically research anything below that, I called it the layer 8 level, the user. Everything below the layer 8, I can do whatever I want as long as users continue to do the things that they do. Not going to be particularly successful. So with that said, phishing does target the weakest link in the chain, and that is the human. And by exploiting the human, technology controls can be overcome, and that's why we can do a number of things at the lower levels, but until we actually understand what's happening at the human level, we're not going to be particularly successful. So the actual techniques that are often used in phishing and spear phishing are a combination of both technological techniques and psychological techniques. Both forms are some form of deception. So here's some typical phishing examples. We had and you're probably well familiar with a number of them. They were rather large. We had the 2015 breach of OPM. Then 2013, we had some studies conducted where we found, where researchers found that 1,942 phishing alerts affecting 259 companies in 32 different countries were affected by phishing and spear phishing, and they led to a huge number of losses of 400 million per company, and then of course we saw phishing increasing on social media. So organizations generally have attempted to respond with the typical in the Department of Defense, we have a situation where our policies are driven by the higher level federal policies that filter on down through the Department of Defense. And then we implement them through various means, through control mechanisms, management structures, and of course training. And so cultural influences play a huge role in the implementation of a program and policies. And attempting to do this across a global market space with a distributed workforce creates an even more formidable challenge relative to that. It's not necessarily that much of a problem that we may potentially see in Department of Defense, but we have the luxury to apply a more uniform policy enforcement environment, but yet we still also in this space have our own challenges as well. So then from the management structures and controls, we've also attempted to go to technological controls, since phishing belongs to the semantic attack family. They have a variety of means of leveraging user interfaces to formulate their attacks, and they can also be mitigated at this level as well. So, for example, you can mitigate Bluetooth phishing, instant message phishing, NFC phishing, and I'm not going to read you the slide. You can read that on your own at your own perusal. But that kind of gives you an idea that we do have some technological solutions that we can deploy. But please bear in mind again that if you're looking at a situation such as spear phishing that is connected with an advanced persistent threat, there will be a means to circumvent these types of technological controls, and they will be rendered potentially ineffective in creating a resistant work environment. Additional technology controls, of course, are filters, content filtering, whitelisting, blacklisting, user alerts, website logos, and so on and so forth. So there are a variety of methods, and I'm not discounting these. I'm just saying that we have these, but in addition to be entirely successful in looking at the phishing problem, we need to understand what is going on with the user. So to that effect, we go through training. And if you have a chance to look at the slides, you'll see that there have been a number of attempts at creating training programs that can help users become more phishing resistant. One of the more popular things that's happening right now are that organizations are launching random phishing attacks against their own organizations to see clicking, who's not clicking, and so on and so forth. Personally, I don't know if that's effective. I don't know. I know it's had some unintended consequences. I know that it has created a variety of undesirable effects within the workforce. So I think the approach of an experienced type training is probably more effective than maybe a video type training or a PowerPoint for that matter. But I'm not really sure how best to deploy that yet without studying the problem more deeply. So all this kind of, we keep coming back to the user. And this is what I just led you through, was basically my journey studying advanced persistent threats in trying to understand what is going on with the user. And so ultimately, I ended up looking at the user psychology and relative to phishing. And in particular, I found this area called behavioral infosec, which interestingly is being led primarily by computer scientists, not necessarily psychologists. And computer scientists also were looking for a variety of things. Phishing was among them, and with these, social media began playing a role in these studies. habits and perceptions of risk were part of these studies, and how risk is conceptualized were a part of these studies. One of the key theories that began to emerge roughly about 2009 as a potential way to help explain why users do what they do was the protection motivation theory. And it's actually an older theory that came out of the medical sciences, and it was used to study things, for example, like why do people continue to smoke after they've, contracted cancer? What's their motivation to protect themselves? And the protection motivation theory consists of threat appraisals, severity and vulnerability appraisals, a coping appraisal, which is something that a person does when weighing out what their actual response is going to be, and then a person's evaluation of their own response efficacy. How effective are they in responding to a threat, and how do they have the right tools to respond to the effects? So there are 6 factors that belong to the protection motivation theory that are looked at. In addition to the protection motivation theory, or PMT as it's often called, habits are theorized to be influencing user behaviors as well, and particularly relative to phishing. And my attention was drawn specifically to a study from 2012, and it was conducted by researchers Van Saponen and Penhill, who combined the PMT and the theory of habit into areas of habits, cognitive mediation, and coping mode to explain the user's lack of compliance with security policies. Now, one of the things that drew my attention about this study was that the conclusions drawn by these researchers was that that user compliance could be improved if we trained people. Fast forward to 2015, where I got a hold of this metric from DNI that basically stated that 91% of all successful breaches were happened by way of social engineering or phishing, and spear phishing in particular. It more or less flew in the face of the conclusions of this particular study. So I decided I wanted to repeat the study, but what I wanted to do was I wanted to look specifically only at a trained population. So while the study was suggesting that you could increase compliance with cybersecurity policies, like I said, in the federal government, we saw that this was not true. So I'm going to click here one more time and go over to the problem statement. So the problem statement that formed the basis of my study was that in order for us to even be able to say whether or not a training program is effective, we need to compare it to something. So the Van Saponen and Penhill study seemed an interesting starting point because it was a quantitative study that captured values relative to these factors of these 2 theories that had been combined, and would allow us to form a baseline of variables relative to a person's motivation to protect themselves and the types of habits that they have. So the idea is that if training is effective, training would then need to change these variables to some degree. So the idea was, let's generate this baseline first, and then let's begin to measure afterwards on trained populations after they received additional training, or if they received new training, and so on and so forth, whether any of these markers moved. So the first point of the research was to actually generate this baseline. So here's the theoretical model for the study. So the idea is that user habits, as defined by the Self-Report Habit Index, feeds into the cognitive mediation process, which is derived from the protection motivation theory, and consists of appraising threats and appraising one's own ability to cope with said threats. And then the coping mode is the actual action of whether or not the person chose to comply with the security policy or not. So the study population was a cross-section of randomly selected individuals, and they were all working in sectors of the federal government who, by policy, should have received some form of cybersecurity training. They were selected from SurveyMonkey, and the target size was 220 surveys. We got 128 responses, but for whatever reason, 66 did not want their responses to be used in the study, so the sample size consisted primarily of 62 respondents. The instrument that we used was a survey instrument that mimicked the original study from Sapone and Penhill, and it was basically a set of scenarios that were designed to capture the factors of PMT and the self-report habit index, and it then had questions relative to these scenarios. So it was a survey instrument that provided you with a situation and offered you then options. And what was very interesting about this particular survey is that there was really no right or wrong answer. It was more or less, how are you processing it? And a number of the feedback components that I received, particularly from subject matter experts, was that the survey drove them crazy because they were trying to solve the security problem, which, we weren't asking them to solve the security problem. We were asking them how they were processing the situation. So it was a very interesting kind of effort. So, here's some of the demographics that we have, and like I said, at your leisure, if you want to peruse these, you'll see that we had a fairly decent mix of individuals, and also from various different educational levels. And so, like I said, the initial intent was to develop this baseline, but then we ran into a rather unexpected situation. 52% of the responding population had never received cybersecurity training, which was quite astounding to us because they all came from sectors that by policy, law, or statute were required to have security training. So we had to, in midsection and almost in mid-study, throw out the initial intent, namely to develop the baseline. And all of a sudden, we had a situation where we were studying vis-a-vis comparison. We were now comparing a trained and an untrained population to each other rather than developing the baseline. And so the analytics for this was a multiple regression study and correlation analysis. And so what we were looking at was to see if we could determine if a linear relationship existed between the independent variables and the dependent variables. So the independent variables would have been things like, do you feel that you are effective in this particular situation and you can solve this particular security problem? And how did that correlate to their ultimate decision as to whether or not they complied or did not comply with a security policy? And we use the Pearson's R as the hypothesis decision point. And I'm showing you these numbers here primarily so you can, on the next chart, actually see how the two different populations stacked up against each other. So here in the trained population, our breaking point to reject the null hypothesis was 0.361, and the untrained population 0.349. So those are, if you kind of keep those in the back of your mind, then as we look at this chart, here were the results. So for the first hypothesis, we didn't have a significant regression in either population, so we could not make any determinations. Now, on the next line, the habitual use of security practices positively influences the perceived severity of a threat and results in security policy compliant behaviors. If you look at each one of these areas where you have the trained population, the untrained population, you'll see that the difference between the two populations is really not particularly remarkable, which really set me back a bit on my heels because I was not expecting this. I was expecting at least higher values coming out of the trained population, but when I saw that they were this close, I really began to ask the question of what is going wrong with training. So we're not getting through somehow. So to that effect, we conducted the study a second time, and basically the second study validated the first study's results. So here we are. We've basically come to the conclusion that for the most part, people are fairly aware of cybersecurity threats, and they are fairly aware of cybersecurity vulnerabilities. They have some confidence in their ability to do something about it. They have some confidence in having enough tools to do something about it. Excuse me. However, one thing that we also noticed is that only 40% of the decision to comply or not to comply with the cybersecurity policy correlated with psychological factors. So that raised the big question: what else is going on that's driving our decisions to ultimately comply or not to comply with a policy? So if our habits and our motivation to protect ourselves only constitutes 40% of our decision-making process, 60% of our decision-making process is happening somewhere else. So this is where I did a deep dive, and this is now from a personal anecdotal perspective. I decided I really needed to kick the tires on this, and so I probably chased down every psychologist I knew and rattled them and asked what was going on, how come this was happening, and I came away with a variety of different answers, but I wasn't sure that any one of them explained what else is going on with somebody when they make a decision to comply or not to comply with the cybersecurity policy. However, as happenstance would have it, I came across a professor emeritus from UCI who was studying social ecology, and he introduced me to social ecology and context-focused studies. These are the folks, for example, who study how airplane noise affects children in schools and things like that. And so they look at contextual variables and how that ultimately influences a particular outcome. And that's when I realized that we probably need to begin looking at cyber this way, because if 60% of our decision-making process is happening because of other things, what are those other things? So in looking at the models that they use in social ecology, they break variables down into various domains. So personal domain, organizational domain, regional domain, national domain, international domain. These are the domains that I've come up with so far that now have variables within them. And so, and the reason I wanted to look at it this way is that here are some fundamental assumptions, and we need to begin understanding ourselves as a function of our own biology, and that in all branches of ecology, there's a statement that is maintained that biological entities such as humans respond to events relative to a given context. The study of biological entities in context is referred to as social ecology. So this is why this particular approach made sense to me. So to date, no studies involving the social ecology of humans relative to social engineering has ever been conducted. So it's appropriate to consider this kind of a study as an exploratory mixed methods study. So mixed methods means that I would want to look, number one, exploratory means that I'm not going to go in with any kind of assumptions. I'm going to leave it completely open to discovery. What are we going to discover if we conduct this study? Next, mixed methods means we're going to use quantitative theoretical model as well as a qualitative approach. And the qualitative is basically going to help us understand what the quantitative variables produce. So that's more or less what I'm proposing. And the conceptual model would require a cross-disciplinary team because if you noticed before when I talked about the different domains, it's going to require people from operational research, technology, counterintelligence, you name it. It's going to be a very cross-disciplinary type of team. And where I would ultimately like to go with this is to develop context-centered models such that we can use computational analytics to begin predicting which organizations are more susceptible to phishing and spear phishing attacks than others based upon their context and the context of the individuals for whom they work with. So let me flip through here actually to the actual model. So here's an example of the model. And one of the things that I would like to draw your attention to are the blue shaded bubbles. Now, what does this model represent? In this particular situation, this model represents an individual who is working in downtown Washington, D.C., is a single parent, and has a child who is in daycare roughly about an hour away. And anybody who's worked in downtown Washington, D.C. on a Friday afternoon knows that if you don't get out of there by 3 o'clock, you're going to get stuck in traffic and you will be there probably until 7 o'clock. So this person needs to leave. They need to leave now. It's 3 o'clock and they need to pick up their child because the daycare is going to close. And they go to shut their computer down and Windows wants to run 37 updates. So we've now put this person into a situation where they are faced with picking up their child or allowing Windows to run updates. I mean, we all know what that person's going to do. That person is going to either leave the machine on and running, which they're not supposed to do, which would be a violation of policy, or they're going to just close it down, and that too is a violation of policy. But they're going to go get their kid because this is an impossible choice. And so the variables that played into this were, from the user's perspective, their job function, their socioeconomic status, their relationship status, their personality, their cultural aspects. Then from the organizational perspective, the variables that played into that were, for example, the organization's policies. Why is the organization running updates on a Friday afternoon in Washington, D.C.? The mission of the organization, which would drive why they're a target to begin with, the organization's culture. Then from the regional variables that play into this, we have things such as infrastructure, bad traffic. We have daycare too expensive in the district itself, so people need to put their children in daycare nearly an hour away. All these variables played into that final ultimate decision for that person not to comply with cybersecurity policies. And day in and day out, people are with contextual variables that ultimately drive their decision to do something in one way or the other. And often be complex that it would really be difficult for any one organization to stand back and attempt to look at that. That's why I believe if we use a computational analytical model, we can probably tickle out some of the more grosser, higher level types of variables that are definitely influencing people's decisions to comply or not to comply. And after that, we can then begin looking at some of these other things like the makeup of a particular organization relative to their protection motivations, their habits, and so on and so forth, and then filter on down into the technological. And then going about it in this very layered approach, I think we can come to some kind of a holistic decision in terms of mitigating social engineering type of attacks. That's why I also believe the development of a social engineering risk tool probably appropriate, because engineering different things than technical. So that's more or less where my research is heading right now. Pending any questions, that's kind of where we are. Like I said, here the proposal is to do cross-disciplinary team. We've got a cyber operations researcher, experimental psychologist, critical infrastructure researchers, advisors from criminology, and social ecology. And ideally, like I said, I'd love to come out of this with a tool that can help organizations determine what their risk is relative to social engineering. So look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Terry. That was an interesting presentation, and yeah, I've got to say that just right at the beginning of your presentation there, I mean, it's that was a striking figure that you identified that over 90% of successful cyber attacks against the U.S. were using phishing or some kind of spear phishing attack. So that's just kind of mind blowing that it could be that high, but
it is that high, yeah.
So let's see. We have one of our attendees. He thinks you're correct about the lack of effective user training. The 2005 quote from Ranum is still valid. If user education was going to work, it would have worked by now. So he's on board with you on that one. So
thank you. Now we got the numbers to prove it.
So does anybody have any questions for Terry on her activities or comments on her work? Also, you got the user perspective graphic was appreciated. They felt that was informative. Okay, so one of our attendees wants to know how do we get secure-minded responses from employees? What can we do to help out in that regard?
Yes, thank you for the question. Yeah, I think that's the holy grail right there. How do we get them on board with security? Well, part of the problem that we have with security is that it is counterintuitive relative to our own psychology. And what I mean by that is if we put on our hunter-gatherer hats here, when we go out and we hunt something, we want to come home with something. But the reward with security is that nothing happens. So if you're being very effective in deploying security, you're not going to have anything happen. So the users basically get no feedback. I mean, there's not something that comes up and says, yay, you just, thwarted XYZ number of attacks. That doesn't happen. And that's very counterintuitive for us as human beings because we like rewards. We've got this whole reward center in our brain that lights up like a Christmas tree every time something great happens. So security is not real great as far as that goes. So it's a real challenge, and I think it's going to require some creativity from management's perspective. We were I was talking to our chief scientist about this, and he said maybe it's even something as simple as weekly update that hey, we were able to thwart XYZ number of attacks or something like that. But then you want to be careful with putting that kind of information out there too, particularly if you're a publicly traded company. You don't want to put out to the world that you're constantly under cyber attack, even though we know this. So it's really it's a very interesting question. If it were me, and I could get up there and do what I would want to do, is I would want to first get a solid understanding of how people feel about security and talk to them and find out where their heads are. And then from there, design a program that could address them where they are. Because what we're currently doing in cyber is we're talking either above folks or we're talking at them, but we're not talking with them. So, for example, the mother or father who has their kid in daycare in Washington, D.C., we haven't asked them that problem. And they're probably not going to tell management that they have a problem. So, we more or less have a means able to communicate with, say, what are biggest impediments in terms of being able to do this? And maybe the answer is, a survey of sort where you just go out and you say, if we want you to do this, how would you think this would be a problem in accomplishing this? So, and I know I'm probably responding as a typical researcher saying, hey, we need to research this. And I know the answers, but that's kind of where I don't know enough about ours yet to be able to say that.
Okay, thank you, Terry. So we have another question, and the individual, comments that research in the human behavior of cybersecurity has, kind of in its initial stages, and he's kind of wondering how long it might take to mature the research in order to implement new techniques, that effectively improve the, the human's behavior and responses.
Yeah, comment, and you're absolutely right. This is research just now around, and we have to be cautious how we're breaking down because there are people's rights and things like that. I mean, anytime I do research involving human subjects, I have to go through an ethics board review and so on and so forth. And there are a lot of things that I can't do. For example, I know I can, use deception and things like that to tickle out answers, but it's kind of a little bit of a challenge. I mean, I think if we think about Cambridge Analytica, for example, and all the trouble that they got themselves into recently, I mean, their research actually started off really with the best intentions. All of a sudden you started going sideways. That kind of research can go sideways pretty quickly. And here's a prime example is that I was looking at called the Big Five personality test, and research had papers that people who rate of the Big Five scale tend to be phished more often than others. And so commenting about this to a chairman of a particular company, and he panicked and he said, "Oh my gosh, the majority of our employees are erotic." And I was like, so I mean, how do you do that? How do you run such a study and say, okay, I'm looking for all the neurotic people here? So it's something that needs to be looked at carefully. But again, I go back also to my other, namely, only 1% of our ultimate decision-making process seems to be related to our psychology and our habits. So 60% is context. So I think where we can influence things the most is what is the contextual environment that we're putting people into? Are we enabling them to act on their worst habits, or enabling them to defend themselves? So, and talk, I'm sure you too can hear there are multiple. There are, how do we for doing good security? How do we put them in the proper context such that we're not, causing them to pit their child against compliance with a policy, and things like that, So I think it's a multiple level approach. And then how do we effectively deploy technology and the management constructs around that to wrap it all up? And it sounds like a huge number it sounds like a huge effort, but frankly, it is very stressful. And this year we are doing everything. So I think it's required extraordinary effort on all of our part to our arms around.
Okay, thank you for the answer to that question, Terry. We've got another one that actually came in from our YouTube, somebody watching on our YouTube stream, and it has to do with emotional intelligence, and they're wondering if improving emotional intelligence would help mitigate human-based risks, and talking about it being a measure of one's self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. So do you have any thoughts on the emotional intelligence aspect?
Well, thanks for that question. to me, emotional intelligence would solve a lot of things. I think anyway, first and ask later, we get ourselves into trouble. And certainly, one of the examples that I like is something that I where people were getting notices from the sheriff, supposedly from the sheriff, that, hey, you moved your car, we're going to your car and we're going to charge you $1 bazillion and all this other stuff, and the person panics and clicks on the link before they even think about something. And then 2 hours later, brain kicks in and they're, wait a minute, sheriff, get my address. How do they even know where I live? And that's when they realize, oh heavens, I've just been had. So yes, emotional intelligence is definitely an improvement, and would definitely improve things. But introspection is let's just put it like this, and I tell you this in all honesty from somebody who spends a whole lot of time sitting on a cushion meditating, that it's hard work. And it's something, how do you get in between that fight or flight instinct that we normally have? Because phishing attacks are very good. They're going to hit you where you live. Now, the first wave, the way they usually do it is the first wave. That's going to be very obvious. It's potentially, people are just going to look at that and say, bah, this is phishing. I'm going to click past this and move on. But then once it begins becoming targeted, these types of attacks are very good, and that they can go all the way to scrubbing social media and using names of your friends and so on and so forth to get you to something. Getting in between, you have to really, really have that very deliberate habit of, no matter who it's from, and unless that email is digitally signed, I'm not going to click on a link that comes to me. And I just recently had that conversation with somebody where I said, I know this email's from you, but I'm not going to this link, see something divine from you. And so, and you kind of, that kind of resistance, I think we're still going to the whole flight instinct thing. And again, please note, I'm a computer scientist, not a psychologist. I'm with an experimental psychologist. So this is where I think they could probably go even more in depth on that topic. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Terry. So one of the individuals wants to kind of look at this from a different direction, a different angle, and he's wondering, would it be possible for the research that you're planning to do, would that allow us to help predict the behavior of the threat actors as well? Have you considered it from that from the folks attacking us angle?
Yes. And actually, that's research. Actually, as some interested party who are very interested in that aspect as well, and who are looking to serve as advisors. Right now, I basically need a sponsor for the research, and once we have the sponsor for the research, I'm pretty sure that sponsor will want that side of it as well. The model can be, and you can all of a sudden get a profile of the attacker as well.
Okay, all right, sounds good.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, another individual is asking. Not sure if you've had it on one of your charts or not, but are there generational differences a consideration in the research?
That's kind of interesting. We didn't see generational differences. Interestingly, where the differences popped up were relative to the training and not training. It seems that the people who had received cybersecurity training were more wary of cyber threats than the people who did receive training, which kind of set us back on our heels, scratching our heads, going, well, how did that happen? And so the only conclusion that we could draw from that was maybe they're wary of something that they don't have a lot of information about, whereas we believe when we're training people, we're giving them a lot of information about threats. But it seems that phishing and spear phishing, they seem to be equal opportunity offenders and go after just about everybody with the same level of success. And at the end of the day, if you think about how we as human beings are kind of constructed, it makes sense that would be that way. We all have a flight or fight instinct. We all, have needs that we need to meet. We all operate in context. While our experience, and generations may play into something, one of the things that we did find were that people who engaged in more risky behavior, and would jailbreak their iPhones and things like that, they get phished more often. And so there's confidence level in there, that the more confident somebody feels, the more likely they are to get phished. And I'll be honest, this confession was that no, I can read computer again. That sometimes be very careful. Well, because I'm like, all right, so they're going to have me. I have got my data in a bazillion different places, and I know how to get it, and I'll rebuild my computer, and I'll figure out what they did, and I'll dissect the whole thing. So it's almost so it might be something like that too.
Oh, that's interesting. That's a interesting take on that. So, kind of another kind of question along a different aspect of that, or so they're asking about has your research looked at different industry sectors, and such that in a different sector, say financial versus manufacturing or healthcare, do you find, if you've looked at that, have you found that one of those industries has employees that are more compliant, and is there a social context that might influence industries where people work that could help in the correlation, regarding determining these risks?
So that question actually gets at the heart of where we want to go with the context studies. That is exactly what we want to try to tickle out with the risk assessment instrument. At this point, we don't necessarily know. Like I said, I came to this area of research by way of studying advanced persistent threats on critical infrastructure. And in particular, I was looking at electrical systems. And the area of concern that I had was that we had all of a sudden connected these rather flat networks to enterprise networks that had outward facing portals to the internet, and these flatter critical infrastructure networks were never really designed to communicate in that way. So they were all of a sudden exposed to a whole host of attacks that they could never in a million years defend against. And so the entry point seems to have always been some kind of email to someone who had some kind of interface to the critical infrastructure. And so that could come by way of billing, accounting, because if you think about how that works, you have the person who's running the system generating the invoices is polling a historian database, which is in turn connected to potentially another historian, which is pulling data from these devices, from these embedded devices. So that's kind of your entry point right there. And I think it has more to do with the job function and the outward facing, and what that particular job function has has a connection to. So for example, in this particular case, your accounting department would have access to your data historians. And so, because that's where they're pulling their data. So I think it's more a function of that. But this is exactly the area of research that we want to get into and find out what is the context, because that goes to the heart of what the context is. Thank you.
That's great. That's great. Sounds, sounds like it's, the path you're leading down. So that's very good. That's very good. I think we have time for just one more question, and the individual, he's commenting that some organizations, internally they're conducting fake phishing attacks, to kind of check on their employees and see how gauge compliance and see how the training is working, and so he's curious: is there do you know of any public data available on that type of compliance? And if so, have you had a chance to look at anything like that?
So this is very interesting, because the very first group of folks who wanted to be a part of our study, they wanted us to study their population. They were actually doing those kinds of tests, and so I couldn't really use their data because their population was tainted. So, but I've now encountered 4 different organizations. I don't know that the data is public. I don't think they would make that kind of information public. That would be very, very sensitive. You would have to really, make sure it's not tied back to an organization, and so on and so forth. But there are a variety of organizations that are trying this right now. There are a variety of tools out there right now. But my biggest concern is that and there's a lot of data being generated, but I don't know that what these tools are telling people really are telling them what's really going on. And my biggest concern is that there is potentially some false sense of security happening here. And here's what I'm talking about, namely people who, adversaries who are involved with these types of attacks are continuously changing their attack approach, if you will. So if you are using a set of canned attacks that a tool is generating, and yes, you update them occasionally, there is an entire spectrum of complexity relative to phishing attacks that these tools probably don't address. They're probably right in the middle. I forgot what the name of the spectrum is right now, but it's on a scale of 0 to 100, where 100 is your most complex, well-heeled cyber adversary who really knows how to craft a real stealthy kind of phishing attack that nobody's ever going to figure out until it's way too late, all the way down to script kiddie type stuff. So there's this range, and they're rated. And from what I've seen so far, these tools kind of target this middle section. But for one, I'm not really sure that middle section is the bulk of what we see relative to phishing attacks. I think it depends. Depends on who the organization is, because if you are, for example, in the defense industry, high value target, you're going to be drawing all of, high level info. So chances are you're going to have more advanced adversaries coming at you. And so if you're using this kind of a tool to assess whether or not your organization is phishing resistant, and the metrics on that comes back and says, yay, verily, everybody's catching it. Number one, you're training them to catch the same kind of thing over and over and over again. And so you might be sending them a message that as long as you're looking for this, you're okay. But then all of a sudden, a different kind of phishing attack comes in. You've trained them to look for something else. So I'm not really, I don't know. I'm not real comfortable with that yet, but I haven't done any studies on it either yet. So, but right now I would say that would be my first caution. Then the second caution that I've heard now directly from companies who are engaged in this is they're having a loss of productivity happening, because people are now just not clicking on anything. And so people are suspicious of every email that comes across their desk, particularly if it looks like it's coming from something like their HR department or their benefits department or something like that. And so because the sanctions seem to be not necessarily, but it's definitely painting a target on you and saying you were the dummy who ended up clicking on this. So I know to do that. They're having a lot of unintended consequences. I think it's an interesting approach, but if it were my organization, I would want to track and to look at the data, and I would want to also look at the type of attacks and see really the attacks that are me, or are these attacks irrelevant to my organization? So a lot of different would want to look at before I would want to deploy this, because it is in essence with your entire culture of your organization. You want to know where you're going to do that. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks for answering that question. Yeah, and I want to thank you, Terry, for your presentation. I think it's a really interesting area. I think looking forward to see what you uncover in the future, and maybe we can revisit this down the road. If anybody has any questions after the fact, if you think of something later on that you'd like to ask Terry about, we have the tech forums on the CSIAC.org website. You can always go there and submit questions, and I checked with Terry beforehand. She said she's more than willing to answer your questions, carry on a conversation. So if you do have anything you'd like to inquire and ask Terry about, like I said, we can continue that discussion via our tech forum. So I want to thank everybody for attending. Thanks for the folks for the questions. A lot of good interaction and questions from the audience today. Appreciate that. And finally, I'd just like to wish everyone a happy holiday season, and enjoy yourselves, and we'll see you in the new year. Have a good one, everybody. Goodbye now.
Bye. Thank you.